If you are a Christian, what is it costing you to follow Christ? I'm not talking about monetary, but your time. A couple hours on a Sunday, often people complain about that because the preacher is going too long. And it's interesting, we say that we're going to spend eternity with the Lord, and yet for many Christians, it's all they can do to spend a couple of hours. In this video, we're going to talk about the cost of discipleship in a passage in Luke chapter 14, verses 25 to 33. And in Luke 14:25, it says, "Now great multitudes went with him, and he turned and said to them." So at this point in Jesus' ministry, enormous crowds, tens of thousands of people are following him, and mainly because of his miracles, he was attracting huge crowds everywhere that he went. Of course, you can imagine giving sight to the blind and healing crippled people and giving the ability to hear to deaf people, curing lepers, raising the dead. All of these things would result in large crowds following you, and that was the case. Great multitudes, it says here, went with him. And verse 26, Jesus says, "If anyone comes to me and does not hate his father and mother, wife and children, brothers and sisters, yes, and his own life also, he cannot be my disciple." Several words that you have to break down here in this verse. The word that's translated hate, and that's the one that kind of jumps off the page at you, is miseo in the Greek, and it literally means hate. And so it's a good translation. So many people question the meaning of this statement. Does Jesus really mean what he says here? Well, to answer that, I would just pose a question. Can you think of a time or a passage where Jesus was just kidding? There aren't any. Jesus meant what he said, and he said what he means. And so there isn't any example where Jesus didn't mean what he said. But does he mean what he's saying here? Again, he's using all-inclusive language when he says, "if anyone," so this is anybody that you're talking about, if they want to come to him and be his follower, and he says you have to hate your father, your mother, your wife, your children, your brothers, your sisters, and even your own self. And he says, if you don't do that, you cannot be my disciple. There's no doubt that Jesus is using very strong language in this verse. But again, remember what it is that he's trying to communicate. He's communicating the importance of putting him first in your life. And nothing and no one should be a bigger priority in your life than your relationship with God. And just as we don't understand love from God's perspective, we also don't understand hate from God's perspective either. We use the word love for everything. I love my wife, I love my dog, I love chocolate, whatever. And even though, as I said, hate is a good translation, another way of saying it that would be easier for us to understand would be to use the words love less. So if you read it that way, if anyone comes to me and does not love less his father and mother, wife and children, brothers and sisters, yes, and his own life also, he cannot be my disciple. So Jesus is talking here about commitment. What's it going to cost to be his disciple? He takes the very closest relationships that we know here on earth, and he says, I need to be more important to you than that. And you could even put it that way. Who is more important? Parents or God? Who's more important? Your spouse or God? Your children or God? Your siblings or God? You, yourself, or God? You see, the bottom line is this: Jesus wants to be number one in your life. And if he's not, then what does he say? He says you cannot be his disciple. He doesn't say you might not, or you'll have a difficult or challenging time. He says you can't. You can't be my disciple unless I'm number one in your life. In Matthew 6:24, Jesus said, "No man can serve two masters, for either he will hate the one and love the other, or else he will hold to the one and despise the other." You cannot serve God and mammon. And so Jesus wants to be number one in your life. He says in verse 27, "And whoever does not bear his cross and come after me cannot be my disciple." This is the second time in this passage that Jesus says, if you don't do what I'm saying, you can't be my disciple. And in this case, in verse 27, he says, if you don't bear your cross and come after me. In Luke 9:23, he says to them all, if any man will come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross daily and follow me. Here, Jesus uses the image of a cross to illustrate what he means by absolute dedication. Being a Christian is going to involve sacrifice. It's not going to be easy. Paul told Timothy in 2 Timothy 3:12, yea, and all that will live godly in Christ Jesus shall suffer persecution. So Jesus is making this point that in order to be his disciple, he has to be number one. And now he's going to use two illustrations to drive home his point or to illustrate his point. Verse 28, for which of you, intending to build a tower, does not sit down first and count the cost, whether he has enough to finish it? Again, it's important to remember the subject of the illustration is Christian discipleship or following Jesus. Jesus pictures here a tower that is a tall structure, something that stands out, and it would be something that would attract attention. It would be something that would be impossible to hide. And when you claim to be a Christian, people are going to notice. They do notice. And you should stand out from the rest of the world. And notice what happens in Jesus' illustration. He says in verse 29, lest after he has laid the foundation and is not able to finish, all who see it begin to mock him. When our lives do not match our profession, people will notice. And when you become a Christian and you don't show signs of growth in your life and maturity in your life in terms of spiritual maturity, you're just like someone who lays the foundation. They begin to build, but then they don't finish. And what does he say in verse 30? Saying, this man began to build and was not able to finish. You're going to be the subject of mockery. Look at so-and-so. Look what he did. If others are not able to see the difference that Jesus has made in your life, then they will conclude that they really don't need Jesus in their life. And I think we can agree that the illustration that Jesus has just given about beginning to build a tower, who doesn't sit down first and count the cost to make sure that you have enough money to finish it, because otherwise you're going to end up with a half-finished building. I think we can agree that that perfectly illustrates his point. But notice he's going to give another illustration. He says in verse 31, or what king going to make war against another king does not sit down first and consider whether he is able with 10,000 to meet him who comes against him with 20,000. Whenever you give more than one illustration to prove your point, it is to express the importance of it. And either one of these illustrations prove the point that Jesus is trying to make in terms of counting the cost when it comes to following him. But again, this second illustration involves a king who has an army of 10,000 and he's going to war against a king that has 20,000, in other words, twice as many. And we are at a war spiritually. In Ephesians chapter 6, it tells us that we are in a spiritual war. And make no mistake about it, we're fighting against a very powerful enemy, an enemy that wants nothing more than to destroy your witness and my witness for Christ. Verse 32, he says, or else, while the other is still a great way off, he sends a delegation and asks conditions of peace. Many Christians today are trying to make peace with the enemy. And we need to make sure that we stand out, that we make God number one in our life, and that we follow him with his help and his guidance. He says in verse 33, so likewise, whoever of you does not forsake all that he has cannot be my disciple. And again, interesting words here. In verse 33, he uses, again, an all-inclusive word with whosoever, and then he says forsaking all. So a lot of people would ask the question, well, how much do I have to give up? And they usually put limits on it or restrictions. I'm willing to give God this much, but not that much. And he says you have to forsake all. And if you don't, again, for the third time in this passage, he says you cannot be his disciple. So what will it cost to be a genuine follower of Christ? And the answer to that is everything. Jesus demands total surrender. And you just have to stop and ask yourself, have you totally surrendered to Him? Have you totally surrendered your life to Him? Or are there things in your life or aspects of your life that you're sort of holding back? Or are there things or individuals that are more important to you than God? If that's the case, then you need to ask for forgiveness and say, Lord, would you please help me to put you first and to make you number one in my life? Well, thank you for taking the time to watch this video, and I very much appreciate you watching it all the way to the end. And I invite you to check out some of the other videos on the channel. There's quite a few Bible studies like this, and Monday, Wednesday, Friday morning, I upload Bible verses of the day to be a blessing and an encouragement. And so please like this video, give it a thumbs up, also share it with someone that might be encouraged by it, and subscribe. All of those things are very helpful to the channel and much appreciated. Well, once again, thank you for visiting The Essential Truth. This is Pastor Dave. You have a blessed day.